title slide, and you can see that I neglected to put a title on it. Make stuff up as we go along. But no, so this segment is, you know, the Juniper expansion impacts on grazing and ranching. And so we'll have that kind of narrow focus here for the next 15, 20 minutes. I might describe, just before I dive in, kind of the nature of the operations. This is spring, late spring, summer grazing country. You know, cold weather. Really starts greening up late March a tiny bit into April. Some of the lower stuff turn out about mid-April, turn out of cattle mid-April. This kind of, these a little bit higher here, probably May turn out. And grazing fairly well through the season, you know, into this time of year, starting to gather off. Usually rotating livestock between 2 or 3 units. Units, though, big, you know, several thousand acres each. This is big scale, big country type of thing. One clarification on a question for Cassie at the end of her talk, sort of the discussion about commercial. So I sort of distinguish between sort of commercial and corporate. So most of the folks that are grazing and ranching in this country I would call commercial, in that the majority of their personal income comes from the ranching enterprise. And then most of our folks are, these are family-owned operations, sometimes multi-generational, but basically encapsulated within a single family. And then there are a few, but really very few, corporate level type ranches and farms that are, you know, more at that scale. So just quick clarification on that. So just kind of a list here, impacts to grazing and ranching. You know, the big one and the key one, obviously, and Cece touched on some of this, and I'll show some slides too. But, you know, basically a reduced forage production when you've got a significant number of juniper on the landscape. That, in turn, can lower the carrying capacity of the given ranch in terms of the number of cattle that they're able to run. And from an economic standpoint, so a lot of these ranches, you know, their fixed costs are their fixed costs, and that's what it is. And so as you lower that production capability, you potentially, you know, bring their sustainability into question, because they're going to have to overcome those fixed costs no matter what. And we'll dive a little bit more into that later. Typically, but a lot of anecdotal, you know, talk from the grazing, the ranchers, that, you know, you get a bunch of juniper and the cattle really don't want to push through this forest. They're looking for open ground, they're looking for forage. And so you may have areas where there's actually some good feed, but if it's kind of surrounded and blocked by a significant, you know, that phase 3 kind of juniper, the cattle don't really want to get up there into it. And so it can restrict even further the amount of ground open for grazing. As far as gather, you know, you can imagine, you stand back and you look at these juniper and you kind of get that landscape view. But when you're in amongst it, even say the phase 2, your view is really blocked as far as how far you can see and what you can see. So you can imagine gathering by horseback, cattle dispersed over these, you know, several thousand acre grazing allotments. It gets to be a lot more days riding where you have to push stuff out of juniper or find stuff out of juniper. Reduce spring flow and water, livestock distribution. So again, you know, this is dry country. Dispersing livestock by having water available mainly through springs, natural springs that are developed and piped into troughs. If we lose those springs and we lose water in a certain area, that again restricts the ability to run livestock in some of these places. Showed the slide about the soil loss and the potential site degradation. Clearly, if that were to happen, that's going to be detrimental to grazing as well. And then that last one, possible late-term abortion in cows. For years and years, we've known about a thing called pine needle abortion. That is where cows in the last trimester of pregnancy there's a certain acid found in pine needles that if the cattle are feeding underneath pine trees, ponderosa pine trees in particular, and consume the needles, that acid can trigger an abortion in that cow. Sometimes they're far enough along, maybe about 20% of the time, that calf is born and it lives, but a significant number of times, the calf is lost and there's trouble with the calving, and sometimes even the cow is lost because she's truly not ready to have that calf. We even tested some juniper in northeastern California in the mid to late 90s for these acids, and back in the poisonous plant lab in Logan, Utah, the samples came back at a very low level, and we thought, okay, well, we're safe. Well, some follow-up work up in Oregon found actually higher levels of these acids, and some anecdotal stuff that kind of was always the beginnings of these investigations were that, you know, these ranchers where they'd come in and done juniper work and laid a bunch of juniper on the ground said, you know what, we're seeing these late-term abortions, and, you know, we're kind of putting 2 to 2 together, and we're wondering about, is this something like the pine needle abortion? Follow-up work indicates that really is a potential thing that's going on, and they want to continue to kind of, you know, do some more tests and get some more samples. But, and it's not something that happens on a typical situation, but, you know, if it's a, you know, any kind of abnormal situation that would encourage cows to consume pine needles, and, you know, classic one in our area is, you know, you get some wintertime feeding areas that are kind of in protected sort of sites, and we talked about the deer getting underneath juniper trees. Well, sometimes people choose to feed cattle in such spots, and so if they start to eat those needles for whatever reason, potentially that would be a big detrimental effect. Okay, I said summary of studies. I really should just say kind of a random cross-section. Summary gives myself too much credit, and a lot of these are mentioned there in the Oregon State publication. But just as an example of some of the forage increases that result of juniper control or lack of juniper compared to where we've got an extensive amount of juniper. So this one study showed basically a threefold increase, or depending on how you want to look at it. They went from needing 22 acres to support a cow, an AUM as an animal unit month, one cow-calf pair for 1 month. So they went from needing 22 acres to provide an AUM of forage down to 7 based on, you know, a juniper control. They also measured forage production directly, and depending on site, they got between 219 and 646 pounds per acre increase in forage after juniper.
And just a quick question.
Yeah.
So is this phase 3, or what are we talking
You know,
about?
and it's variable, so I don't even know, Kevin, but my guess is where you get to see the higher numbers, I would say phase 3.
Okay.
Yeah. So the second one down, even a bigger increase, 900% increase in biomass, 350% increase in herbaceous cover. That's Bates out of that work done out of Burns, Oregon. Again, that one I would assume pretty high level of juniper to start with. Next study down, increased cover from 2% to 11%. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that's 5-fold increase. Next to last one, yeah, a little bit of an increase, but not a lot. And then Don Coltrap did some work throughout Lassen and Modoc County and found a significant relationship between herbaceous cover and biomass and juniper canopy, but it wasn't a strong, you know, this correlation was, you know, the R-squared was like 0.1. It's really site dependent in terms of what the actual response is, and as Kevin's question, it's also dependent on how much juniper we're talking about before any kind of treatment. So I guess the bottom line is, you know, it can vary, but the potential for increased forage production is significant. Okay, just some pictures that I think probably drive the point home better. You know, I would categorize this site as kind of between phase 2 and phase 3. But if you look here, you know, at the understory, you see very little herbaceous production, right? And that's Juniper site. All right, the difference between these pictures and the pictures I just showed, about 80 yards, and this is a site that had been treated 2 years previous. CC talked about some, the dramatic increase. This site was not seeded. This is just natural release. Kind of, CC also talked about, these are natives. So we've got kind of the classic assemblage of native bunch grasses that we have in the Intermountain area: blue bunch wheatgrass, bottombush squirreltail. There was a perennial bluegrass in there that it was too far gone, I couldn't identify the species, and then Great Basin wild rye. This bottom one actually is a different site, and this was being deferred, not grazed. This site actually was grazed this year. This is at the end post-grazing, okay? So a lot of forage, and when we grow a lot of forage at the stocking rates that we're running, a lot of it gets basically unused, which is fine. But you can just see, if you go, think back and forth between, toggle back and forth. If you're a rancher and you make your money based on your cows converting grass to beef, you go from that to that. That's pretty dramatic, and if you multiply that over a large number of acres. So then the other thing is, beyond grass, I know I'm supposed to be focusing on ranching and grazing, but bitter brush, antelope bitter brush, Persia tridentata, real significant forage for deer in particular in our area. The leader growth, this plant here, this bitter brush plant here, this is the leader growth. The leaders are the most nutritious part of that plant, and it's also where most of the seed production takes place. This is in an area where there's juniper present. These two are, again, adjoining site where the juniper was treated. And this one, it was almost hard to get down to where the leader started. I mean, it's just, this plant's going crazy. Release of competition and moisture and a lot more leader growth. So even, going kind of back in the wildlife hat again a little bit, the amount of forage that we can produce on these sites is amazing. So some of the indirect effects. So, we kind of talked about the direct ones, but there's also indirect. When I say indirect, I don't want to minimize this. These can be really significantly and really meaningful to a ranching enterprise. But if we got a lot of juniper on the uplands, what's left to graze in a lot of times? A lot of times it's these riparian areas that are the most sensitive to concentrated livestock use, where we really don't want concentrated livestock use, but it's where the only or most of the remaining forage is. These are, by and large, a lot of public lands. There's regulations on how much use can take place in those riparian zones. If you reach your allotted use in that riparian zone, those cattle need to go off that allotment. So financially, that's a big deal, potentially, for a ranch. Cattle aren't the only thing out there. We've got a lot of wild horses. If I was speaking locally, I'd be inclined to use the feral horse term as opposed to wild horse. Don't mean to offend any wild horse folks. But they're out there, wildlife is out there, and again, as we shrink this pool of available forage, we're just intensifying that competition for what's left and putting more pressure on that ground. So, CC talked about sage grouse and the implications of juniper on sage grouse. Believe me, the ranchers do not want to see a listing if that's at all possible to avoid, because it's more regulation, it's more red tape, it's more time, and it restricts kind of the flexibility of what they can do on the land. And so certainly from their grazing, management of those grazing operations, they would rather not see that take place. And then this is kind of a less significant, but it's still reality. Where we go in and we do these juniper restoration efforts, we usually want to rest from grazing for 1, 2, maybe 3 years, depending on the situation. And so, that is a cost. You gotta find somewhere, the cattle just don't go sit in the closet for a year. You've gotta find somewhere to keep them fed and to keep that operation going. Most ranchers would gladly give this up for the long-term gain, but it is a cost. All right, so Gabe, you're the economist in the group. Could you turn away or? This is I guess one step below the back of the bar napkin sort of stuff. So anyway, don't quote it, but just kind of thinking our way through. So we know that, the potential effects on forage production is variable but significant. So we say 1,000 pounds of dry forage is what's required to sustain a cow-calf pair for a month. And if we assume that that calf in that month time is probably putting on 70 pounds, a little bit more than 2 pounds per day, putting on, adding 70 pounds of beef in that month, the value of that, roughly $100, okay? If we could increase an AUM per 8 acres, and so I would look at that as saying, maybe we would get a boost in production by 250, 300 pounds per acre. We're not going to graze all of that. We're going to leave part of that, to keep the plant health and plant vigor and that sort of thing. So if we grazed about 40%, we used about 40% of that production, we could add, potentially, just all theoretical, an AUM for every 8 acres, okay? So that would give us a per acre value of $12.50, this $100 divided by 8. $12.50 per acre. Final environmental impact statement looking region-wide on restoring the stage step proposes 1.25 million acres to treat. So, given all the, statements we would need to, weasel words we'd want to throw in there, if you multiply that number by that number in our community, that's a lot of. Now, again, this is gross production, this isn't profit, this isn't anything, but it is something that's going to be adding to the overall economic driver in our community. And that, again, we got 9,000 people in Modoc County, 30,000 people in Lassen. Those kind of figures are significant in our communities. Okay, so, any questions?
How does the sagebrush recover? Because you've shown a lot of grasses and stuff, but that's sort of critical for
and so the sagebrush, and again, it sort of depends on where we are on the phase 1, 2, 3 thing. But assuming we're in phase 3 and we've lost that sagebrush, you know what, speaking of that, I want to go back to something. I'm glad you asked that question. So I'll answer your question, then I'll show something on the slides. Depending on where you are, if we've lost that sagebrush, it's a longer time. So the grass will respond quickly. It takes, and again, all site dependent, and all these variables we can't necessarily pin down to the exact number, but it's going to be a significant number of years before that sagebrush. It comes in from seed, it's not a sprouter, so it's a significant amount of time before, and I would say it could be 20 years, it could be 30 years, who knows.
So phase 3, initially when I came in there, it was like, phase 3, it's trash, it's like not, it's going, in space, stage transition, it's like, you're sucked, you're done. But it doesn't sound like that. It sounds like it can't, at least for some sites, right? There's a site dependency, that this stuff could come back. And so what I'm wondering is, one of the things, this is scary a little bit now, but the idea that using fire, reintroducing fire as a management tool, there's this issue like, man, if you run a fire through these places, it's just going to be all cheatgrass and Medusa head. But has anyone actually, this is not a great time to talk about fire here. I know from personal experience, but is this something that someone's actually done to try to run a fire somehow through these really dense patches and then see what happens? Is it really that bad?
I think, there's definitely been wildfires through these patches, right, that we've been able to observe. The downside of fire on these patches is the fuel load is so heavy and they burn so hot that you get a certain level of soil sterilization.
2 kilowatts.
So most of all these things that we're showing and talking about are mechanical treatments. where mechanically we go in, we harvest the juniper, it goes to chips like TC was describing, and basically releases the site. It is amazing to think, you just don't see. And when we first dove into this, Jim Young had published some stuff talking about, 1 perennial plant per 2 square meters or something like that as a guideline to whether you needed to seed or not. I don't think we would come up with that on this site, and yet we see the response that we see. So yeah, grass-wise, I think we see these responses on certain sites where we're really blown away by what happens there. As far as fire, I think that's a little bit different question. The one thing I wanted to show after her question, and it doesn't show up that good, I apologize, but you see all these little, like there's one, there's one, there's one. Over here, one of these has several, there's several. These are all dead sagebrush skeletons. Okay? We're there, we're thriving, they're dead. There's just skeletons, they're just, what's left. And it's really, you do this, and again, you sort of get used to seeing it such that it doesn't really click until you really think about it, but there's no question on these heavier juniper sites you can walk into, and search for this is just on the land, you go out there and there it is. So anyway, definitely real evidence of that losing that stuff understory.
David, I actually wanted to sort of address your question
Yeah.
for a second. So I'm part of the group called the Sagebrush State Study and Evaluation Project. We did burn big stands of juniper. And one of the things that we expected was we thought that, like Kevin just said, we thought phase 3 is, we sort of had this, I don't know if I can draw this backward, but sort of imagine this threshold that we, if this graph, and we have underdoor here as a function of, we're going this way and then this way, we kind of expected a crash. And we, at this sort of phase 2, phase 3, that sort of transition after that, we would, to some extent, as you get to hard drier, especially in the southeastern part of Asia. But in general, our models, there is no threshold. It just goes straight down all the way through, which suggests to us that you may be able to treat these things later. So if CC was mentioning about you can still get flush of brain after a phase 2 treatment, that it appears that there's still going on in others. And that, so those are not published. They are in the process of being reviewed right now, and I need not update. It seems like this story is a little bit different than I think.
One thing that I would have, Tim maybe jump in here if I'm misstating it, like from sort of a practical application, one of the issues with treating stage 3 is just getting the fire prescription with that level of fluid that you can, as opposed to something that's a lot less. So, did you have another question?
Yeah, I was wondering, given that so what it seems to me is that the juniper is good for the ranch, if you get grass, but how is that tying into the sage grouse if they need the sage and it's taking so much longer? Are you showing any changes in the populations of the
So,
grouse?
again, it goes back to if you're thinning or taking juniper out in those sort of phase 1, phase 2 deals, then the effect is immediate.
Yeah.
Because basically you've removed that sort of perch deal that and Pete's got a great poster in back that kind of talks about this avoidance of those sites. So in those sites, yeah, you get the immediate. In these sites where you've lost your shrub layer, you think you get a positive benefit, but it's more of a longer term deal. You get at some point you got to set that successional clock back.
Right.
And so the sage grouse are not going to see sage there for quite some time. But the other thing is, so they nest very heavily under sagebrush, but they forage outside of sage. And so opening stuff like this up for forbs and green herbaceous vegetation, they're not seed eaters, no crop, they eat green vegetation. So from a foraging standpoint, rootering standpoint, I think even where you don't have brush, you do have a benefit.
Yeah, David, I'd like to expand on that a little bit. So we have about 8, I work for USGS conducting research, and we have about 8 study sites where we're tracking sage-grouse across Nevada and California. And we have been for about 10 years in various areas. And we're trying to address these types of questions. But what we found in our selection models